Welcome to the Purposeful Podcast.
Imagine two completely different lives. In the first one, you are a Harvard-educated executive at Merrill Lynch.
Okay.
You have an MBA, you are incredibly successful in this high-stakes world of finance, and you actually retire in your 40s to become a philanthropist.
Wow, so living the absolute dream.
Exactly. You live in an 18,000 square foot mansion in Connecticut. And just to, really paint the full picture here, this house has 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 pools, 7 garages. And it costs over $90,000 a month just to maintain.
Which is, that is the ultimate cinematic picture of traditional financial success. The kind of life most people assume comes with having all the answers, right?
Right. Now hold that image in your mind and let's imagine the second life. You were born in rural Vermont, the first person in your family to ever graduate high school. You spend 25 years fixing cars at a gas station, and then another 17 years sweeping floors as a janitor at JCPenney.
So a very, very different trajectory.
Completely. You buy a 2-bedroom house for $12,000 at age 38, and you live in that exact same house for the rest of your life. And your main hobby is chopping firewood.
A quiet, incredibly modest life. One that flies completely under the radar.
But here is the massive reveal. In the year 2014, those two lives converged in the national headlines, but for very different reasons. That Harvard-educated executive, Richard Fuscone, went entirely bankrupt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the 2008 financial crisis had basically turned his world to dust, leaving him with astronomical debt and all these illiquid assets. His massive mansion, the one where guests used to dine and dance on a see-through floor over an indoor swimming pool, was sold in a foreclosure auction for literally pennies on the dollar.
Which naturally makes you wonder what on earth happened to the janitor.
Right. So that exact same year, 2014, the janitor, Ronald Reed, passed away at the age of 92. And he didn't die broke. He died with an $8 million fortune.
$8 million from sweeping floors.
Yes. He left $2 million to his stepkids and more than $6 million to his local hospital and library. And there was no lottery win. There was no secret wealthy uncle who left him an inheritance. He simply put tiny, consistent savings into blue chip stocks, those massive, reliable companies that just slowly churn out profits. And he left them alone to grow for decades.
That contrast frames everything we are exploring today. Two men, vastly different educations, vastly different incomes, completely inverted outcomes.
Exactly. So today we're going on a deep dive into the source material for Morgan Housel's brilliant work, The Psychology of Money. And our mission for you, the listener, is to uncover a mind-bending truth hidden in these sources. Doing well with money has very little to do with how smart you are and absolutely everything to do with how you behave. It is a soft skill. It is not a hard science.
And that distinction changes the entire paradigm.
Right.
We are traditionally taught finance as if it were a branch of physics. We're handed strict rules, mathematical laws, and complex formulas. The assumption is that if you put the right data into a spreadsheet, it will spit out the universally correct answer. But that completely ignores the human element. Finance should really be taught like psychology, embracing all the messy emotion, ego, and nuance of the human brain. Because knowing what to do mathematically tells you absolutely nothing about what happens in your head when you actually try to execute it in the real world.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sources propose a concept early on that I found, frankly, to be a huge relief. And it's that no one is actually crazy.
Right.
People do baffling, seemingly irrational things with money all the time, but fundamentally no one is crazy. We just all view money through vastly different lenses.
What's fascinating here is that it comes down to the sheer limits of our individual perspective. The research points out this wild statistic. Your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.0000001% of what has actually happened in the global economy. But those highly specific, very limited experiences dictate roughly 80% of how you subconsciously think the entire world works.
Think about the generational trauma of the stock market. Like if someone was born in 1950, what was their experience?
Well, if you were born in 1950, the stock market went literally nowhere, adjusted for inflation during your teens and 20s.
Right.
Those are your core formative years. It's the time when you are learning how the world operates. So you would naturally view the market as a stagnant, risky place. But if you were born just 20 years later, in 1970, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold during that exact same stage of your life.
So those two groups of people are going to walk through the rest of their lives with completely opposed subconscious views on investing. And it's not about one group being smarter or more educated than the other. It's just the dumb luck of when they happen to be born. born. There's a brilliant quote in the text from John F. Kennedy that perfectly captures this blind spot.
Oh, the one about the Depression.
Yes. In 1960, a reporter asked him what he remembered from the Great Depression, and Kennedy admitted he had zero firsthand knowledge of it. His family had one of the great fortunes of the world, and they actually acquired bigger houses and more servants during the 1930s. He told the reporter, "I really did not learn about the Depression until I read about it at Harvard."
That is such a striking admission. It highlights that no amount of studying, reading, or open-mindedness can genuinely recreate the raw, visceral power of fear and uncertainty. You can read textbooks about losing everything, but if you haven't felt the agonizing knot in your stomach looking at your kids and wondering if your investments just imperiled their entire future, you simply aren't going to behave the same way as someone who's lived it.
Let's apply that lens to something that always baffles me, which is lottery tickets.
Ah, yes.
The poorest Americans, the lowest income households, spend a staggering amount on lotto tickets. I'm talking about an average of $412 a year. Now, intuitively, that sounds completely irrational. Roughly 40% of Americans couldn't come up with $400 for an unexpected emergency. So, to play devil's advocate here, mathematically, isn't that just throwing their safety net away on a 1 in a million chance? How do we justify that behavior?
Well, we don't have to justify the math. We have to understand the emotional narrative. Try to look at it exclusively through their lens. For someone living paycheck to paycheck where saving even $10 seems impossible, a new car, a vacation, or a safe neighborhood feels entirely out of reach. It's a mathematical impossibility in their current state. Buying a lottery ticket serves a very specific psychological utility. It is the only time in their week they can tangibly purchase the feeling of hope. They are buying the dream of financial stability that wealthier people take for granted every single day.
So they aren't paying for a return on investment. They are paying for a moment of psychological relief.
Precisely. It's a narrative that checks a critical emotional box for them in that specific moment. Recognizing why they do it proves the overarching point. Financial decisions are rarely made on a spreadsheet. They are made at the dinner table, heavily influenced by personal history, stress, and emotion.
That desire for a lucky break ties right into another massive blind spot we have with money. It's how we measure success and failure. The text introduces two forces that constantly mess with our outcomes, calling them siblings or doppelgangers: luck and risk. You really cannot respect the reality of one without acknowledging the power of the other. And the story of Bill Gates illustrates this beautifully.
It really does. Because when we look at tech billionaires, we tend to attribute all of their success to pure intellect and grind. We ignore the invisible hand of luck entirely.
We absolutely do. In 1968, Bill Gates was a 13-year-old kid attending Lakeside School in Seattle. Now, Lakeside was incredibly unique because the school's Mothers Club used $3,000 from a rummage sale to lease a state-of-the-art computer. In 1968, most university graduate schools didn't even have a computer this advanced.
The math on that advantage is staggering. Out of roughly 303 million high school-age kids in the world at that time, only about 300 went to Lakeside. That is a 1 in a million head start.
Even Gates himself has admitted, if there had been no Lakeside, there would have been no Microsoft. But here is the heartbreaking flip side of that exact same coin. Back at Lakeside, Gates had a best friend named Kent Evans. They were absolute intellectual equals. Gates was so close to him that he still remembers Kent's phone number from 8th grade.
Wow.
Yeah, 525-7851. They used to scheme about their future, talking endlessly about being CDOs together. Kent easily could have been a founding partner of Microsoft, but Kent died in a mountaineering accident before graduating high school.
The odds of being killed on a mountain in high school are roughly 1 in a million. It is the exact same force as Gates's incredible luck, the exact same magnitude, just working in the opposite direction. That is risk.
It really makes you pause and rethink how quickly we judge people.
It should serve as a major warning about the dangers of extreme examples. We have this tendency to look at wildly successful people and try to extract a perfect, replicable formula for success. Take Cornelius Vanderbilt. He famously broke the law to expand his massive railroad empire, famously declaring, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" Today, business books often praise that as the trait of a scrappy, bold visionary. But we turn around and criticize executives at Enron with equal passion for their reckless, law-breaking behavior. The only difference is the outcome.
The line between inspiringly bold and foolishly reckless is a millimeter thick, and usually we only see it with hindsight.
So the takeaway for you listening is to practice grace. Don't judge yourself or others solely by the final outcome. When things go incredibly well in your career or portfolio, you have to stay humble and acknowledge the role of luck. And when you or a business fails, you need to leave room for forgiveness. Sometimes you made the right bet, but you just ended up on the unfortunate side of the unforgiving reality of risk.
Moving from surviving risk to knowing when to stop, the sources dive into the immense danger of never enough. There's this fantastic anecdote about the authors Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller. They are at a lavish party hosted by a billionaire hedge fund manager. Vonnegut nudges Heller and points out that their host made more money in a single day than Heller's massively successful book, Catch-22, had made in its entire history. And Heller's response is just legendary.
He tells Vonnegut, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough."
Enough. It's such a simple concept, but the lack of it absolutely destroys people who have already won the game.
The sources provide stark, terrifying examples of this. Look at Rajat Gupta. He was the CEO of McKinsey, worth an estimated $100 million by 2008. Or look at Bernie Madoff, who ran a highly profitable, completely legitimate market-making business for years before his infamous Ponzi scheme. Both of these men had unimaginable legitimate wealth. They had power, prestige, and ultimate freedom. Yet they risked it all, resorting to insider trading and fraud because they lacked any internal sense of enough.
Why do that? Why risk $100 million in your freedom for an extra $10 million you don't even need?
Because they were playing a game of social comparison. They were comparing themselves to billionaires with even more money. And social comparison is a battle you literally cannot win. The ceiling is so high that no matter how much you accumulate, someone else always has more. If you don't define your own goalpost, it will constantly move.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's contrast that destructive chasing with someone who used time rather than reckless risk to their advantage. Warren Buffett. As of the writing of these sources, Buffett's net worth was roughly $84.5 billion. But here's the wild part. $81.5 billion of that came after his 65th birthday.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that statistic forces us to completely rewire how we understand wealth creation. It's the counterintuitive magic of compounding, which is essentially just earning interest on your interest so it snowballs over time. The author uses a brilliant analogy here regarding the history of Earth's ice ages. For a long time, scientists assumed ice ages required massive, dramatic events to freeze the entire planet. But it turns out the culprit was incredibly subtle. It was just moderately cool summers.
So it wasn't a catastrophic blizzard?
Not at all. A summer simply wouldn't get warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow. That left a thin base of ice, which reflected sunlight, which cooled the planet just a tiny bit more, leading to slightly more snow the following year. It compounded. Small changes in conditions, left uninterrupted, created a miles-thick ice sheet.
And that ice sheet is Warren Buffett's portfolio. His secret isn't just that he possesses some superhuman ability to pick stocks. His secret is that he started investing when he was 10 years old and never stopped.
To put this in sharp perspective, look at Jim Simons, the legendary head of the hedge fund Renaissance Technologies. Simons compounded his money at 66% annually. Buffett compounded at roughly 22%. Mathematically, Simons is a vastly superior investor. But Simons didn't find his true investment stride until he was 50 years old. Because he had less than half as many years to let his money snowball, his net worth is actually 75% less than Buffett's. Good investing isn't about earning the highest returns. It's about earning sustained, uninterrupted returns for the longest possible period of time.
But to get those uninterrupted returns, you have to actually survive the journey. Which brings us to a crucial realization. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are two completely different skill sets. Getting money requires taking risks, being optimistic, and putting yourself out there. But keeping money, that requires the exact opposite.
It requires a profound level of paranoia. It requires an acceptance that whatever you've made can be taken away just as fast by forces outside your control.
Let me take you back to October 1929. Jesse Livermore was widely considered the greatest stock market trader of his day. During the infamous crash, while everyone else was losing their shirts, Livermore had shorted the market. He was essentially placing a massive bet that stock prices would inevitably crash. He went home to his terrified wife and told her he had just had his best trading day ever, making the equivalent of $3 billion in a single week.
An unimaginable windfall while the rest of the world burned.
Right. At the very same time, a multimillionaire real estate developer named Abraham Germansky was entirely ruined by the crash and vanished, last seen wandering the street, scattering torn ticker tape on the sidewalk. Both men were brilliant at getting wealthy. But wait. 4 years later, Livermore, who was now overflowing with invincibility from his big win, made larger and riskier bets. He ended up in massive debt, lost everything in the market, and tragically took his own life.
Surviving capitalism over the long haul is brutally hard. To do it, you need what the author calls a barbelled personality. On one end of the barbell, you have to be highly optimistic about the long-term future, but on the exact opposite end, you need to be intensely paranoid about the short-term obstacles that can prevent you from reaching that future. You have to build in a margin of safety, having enough buffer in your life to survive the worst-case scenarios. A frugal budget, flexible thinking, a solid cash emergency fund. These don't just protect you, they increase your odds of survival so you can stick around long enough for compounding to actually work its magic.
And if you can survive the volatility, you get to benefit from the rule of tails. By tails, we mean the extreme far ends of a distribution curve, the rare, massive events. You can actually be wrong half the time and still make an absolute fortune.
We often think of success as a constant, unbroken string of wins. But in reality, long-term success is usually the result of a few massive tail events offsetting a mountain of duds.
Look at the art world. Heinz Berggruen was one of the most successful art dealers of all time. His secret? He basically acted like an index fund. He bought massive quantities of art, Picassos, Braque, Matisses. Think about how painful it must have been to hold on to thousands of pieces of art that ended up being practically worthless. 99% of his portfolio was a dud, but he survived long enough for the 1% to become the defining masterpieces of the century.
And we see the exact same dynamic in business. By the mid-1930s, Walt Disney had produced over 400 cartoons, and most of them lost a fortune. The studio was deeply struggling. Then came Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. One 83-minute film made so much money it paid off all the company's accumulated debts and entirely funded their new Burbank studio.
One film erased 400 failures. And the sources show this happens in the broader stock market too, right?
Absolutely. JP Morgan Asset Management analyzed the Russell 3000 index. They found that since 1980, 40% of all the companies in that index effectively failed. They lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered, 40%. Yet the index overall provided spectacular wealth-building returns. Why? Because virtually all of the overall returns came from just 7% of the companies that performed exceptionally well.
7% of the companies carried the other 93%.
Yeah.
That is wild. It really proves that the tails drive everything. Which means, as an investor, your success isn't about being right every day. It's about how you behave during the rare moments of pure chaos. Let's walk through a scenario with 3 hypothetical investors to prove this. Sue, Jim, and Tom.
Okay.
They each invest $1 a month in the U.S. stock market from the year 1900 to 2019, a span of 119 years.
Think about all the chaos in those 119 years. World wars, depressions, pandemics.
Exactly. Now, Sue is relentless. She invests her dollar every single month, rain or shine, boom or bust. Jim gets terrified during recessions. He sells his stocks and holds cash until the recession ends, then buys back in. Tom takes a little longer to react. He sells 6 months after a recession starts and waits 6 months after it ends to buy back in. How do they end up? Tom ends up with about $234,000. Jim has $257,000. But Sue ends up with $435,551.
Consider the psychological toll of Sue's strategy. She had to sit on her hands and do absolutely nothing while watching her portfolio drop 30, 40, sometimes 50%. Human nature screams at us to tinker to protect our money. But the math tells us that doing nothing is your greatest weapon. Napoleon defined a military genius as the man who can do the average thing when all those around him are going crazy. Investing is the exact same discipline.
So what does this all mean? We've talked about compounding, about tails, about survival, and defining enough. But what is the actual point of accumulating all this money? Why do we care so much?
The sources point to a profound psychological study by Angus Campbell from 1981. Campbell is trying to figure out what objectively makes people happy. He found that it wasn't income, geography, or education. The most dependable predictor of happiness was having a strong sense of controlling one's life. He concluded that the highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today.
Controlling your time is the highest dividend money pays. The author actually shares a personal story about this that really resonated with me. In college, he scored a highly coveted, high-paying investment banking internship in Los Angeles. He thought he had won the career lottery. But on his first day, he realized that in exchange for that massive paycheck, the bank owned every waking second of his time. He couldn't go home before midnight. It was a miserable, exhausting experience, completely devoid of any autonomy. It was supposed to be a 4-month internship. He quit after just 1 month.
This raises an important question for you listening to this right now. Look at your own financial goals. We often think of an emergency fund as just a boring pile of cash sitting in a checking account. But it's not just cash. It is freedom. It is the freedom to not be terrified of a boss, because you know you wouldn't be financially ruined if you needed to take a few months off to pivot. It's the ability to wait for a job you actually want, rather than taking the very first one you find out of desperation. True wealth is the independence that comes from unspent assets.
Unspent assets equal options. I love that. Well, that brings us to the end of today's deep dive into the psychology of money. Thank you for joining us as we unpack these sources. Before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over on your own. We spend so much of our lives, our healthiest, most energetic, capable years trading our precious time to acquire money. But if the ultimate purpose of that money is simply to eventually buy back our time, are we spending the best years of our lives chasing a currency we already possess? Think about it.